times we're not interested in numbers. Well, God is. There's a whole book about it. We're not interested in numbers for numbers' sake. We're interested in numbers when numbers represent people, persons, souls who need Jesus. Numbers chapter 21, beginning with verse 4. Children of Israel are almost at the end of the wilderness wanderings, which took up about 40 years. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass or to circumvent the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged or shortened because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses. Wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses and said, We've sinned, for we've spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take the serpents away from us. And Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it on a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass. Brass represents judgment in the Old Testament. Made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked upon the serpent of brass, he lived. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in Oboth. And they journeyed from Oboth and pitched in Ijeabarim in the wilderness which is before Moab toward the sun rising. And from thence they removed and pitched in the valley of Zered. And from thence they removed and pitched on the other side of Arnon, which is in the wilderness that cometh out of the coast of the Amorites. For Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. We'll stop reading right there, but you notice the children of Israel began to move forward again once the fiery serpent issue is solved. Children of Israel complaining against God and against Moses. Lots of complaining going on in the wilderness because their heart's not been right with the Lord. Sin distorts our view of reality. Sin makes us reject that which is sent for our good and makes us embrace that which is therefore evil. Sin blinds us to the goodness of God, and it creates an illusion that the enemy, Satan's things, are better. The children of Israel have struggled with this ever since they left Egypt. They complained just 3 days after they crossed the Red Sea. After the song of Moses that they chimed in and sang with, and the singing of Miriam by the Red Sea after the Egyptian army was all destroyed, the sound of that singing had just barely died out, and they were griping, You brought us out into the wilderness to kill us. They came to a place where there was an oasis, and they named it Marah, or bitter, because the waters were so bitter they couldn't drink it. Moses had cried to the Lord, and the Lord had pointed out a tree that he could cut down, cast into the waters that made them sweet again. They moved from there to a place with 70 palm trees, a lot of shade, and 12 wells of water, one per tribe. But griping and grumbling comes easier than trusting the Lord. And how often do even people who know the Lord fall into griping and grumbling? We look at the glass and it's half empty instead of half full. We get our eyes on the wrong things. We look at the circumstances we're in rather than the deliverer who has come through for us so many times before. Here they are, grumbling again. They've been grumbling steadily ever since the end of chapter 10. You know what happens in chapter 10? They send spies into the promised land. One spy from each tribe to go and overlook the land and check it out and make sure it really is a land flowing with milk and honey. They spend 40 days searching out the land and they come back. 2 of them were carrying 1 bunch of grapes from the valley of Eshcol. From the vineyards there that produced so much grapes that 1 bunch of grapes, it took 2 men to carry 1 bunch of grapes. It's a lot of grapes. But 10 of the spies said there's no way we can possess the land because the people are stronger and mightier than we. They have cities that have walls that reach up to heaven. And there's the people, some of them are so big we are like grasshoppers. They can step on us and squash us. 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua. And Joshua was he was the special body servant of Moses. And he's been in training, though he didn't really know it, to be the next leader. But it's God's plan. Caleb and Joshua by this time are among the very, very few people who are still alive. It's been 40 years since then. It's been 40 years since the spies went into the land. And after the spies went into the land and the people refused to go into the promised land, God said, okay, you can stay right here in the wilderness for 40 years until the whole generation, everybody that's 20 years old and older, will die. You think about how many people that was. 40 years. You do the math sometime when you're not too busy. Figure up 2.5 million people. We know that there were 603,550 men that could fight in a war that left Egypt. It was about a year, slightly over a year, when they left Mount Sinai, a year from when the Exodus took place, when they crossed the Red Sea. You figure up in 40 years how many people per day would be dying. They'd be having lots of funerals every day around the camp of Israel, as people were dying like flies. And it's exacerbated by the repeated rebellion of the people against God. They rebelled against Him in not going into the promised land when He opened the door wide open for them, and it started them down a path of rebellion and unbelief. Most of those people are dead now. Aaron just died in the chapter verses right before the beginning of chapter 21. Aaron has died. His son Eleazar is now going to be the high priest. Miriam has died, Moses' sister. Moses is not going to live much longer himself because Moses had even gotten pulled into the rebellion. In chapter 20, when he hit the rock that he was supposed to speak to cause water to come from it, God sent the water, God gracious. But we do have to reap the fruits of our doings. Lots of murmuring. In fact, I think in every church I've pastored, I've taught my way through the book of Numbers. And there's a whole section begins in chapter 13 that goes through chapter 21 that in the way I outlined the book, I've entitled it Murmurings in the Wilderness, because that's what they're doing. So they don't like the food. They don't like the leaders. They don't like this. They don't like that. They have these self-appointed committees, like with the "we need a new preacher" committee. You know, we need a new leader. We need to get rid of Moses. We have the "let's go back to Egypt" committee. You know, we have the "let's campaign for different food" committee. We don't like the manna. We need quail. We need meat. All of that stuff. The thing is, during that period, they're not making any progress in reaching toward the promised land. They're just wandering in circles while people are dying. There's lots of saved people who have received Jesus Christ as their Lord who make very little progress in their spiritual lives during the time they're here taking up space and breathing air. There's lots of folks that sort of wander around in circles after they received Jesus. Somehow they didn't get it, that the receiving of Jesus Christ as Lord is not the finish line, it's the starting line. And once you receive Jesus as Lord, it's to begin a life of taking steps of faith. Studied about Abraham in the last hour. You know, the call of Abraham. God had said, "Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless them that bless you, curse him that curses you. In thee will, and in thy seed will all the families of the earth be blessed," etc. Moses had to give up a whole lot of stuff before he could begin to experience the fulfillment of all that sevenfold promise that God made to him right there. Receiving Jesus Christ as Lord is to be the start of a whole new way of life. And it begins with turning loose of everything else. It's like flying in a plane. You can't stay on the ground and be flying. You can't fly with one foot on the ground. You can't float in a boat with one foot on the shore. You've got to abandon yourself to that plane or that boat, and if it sinks, you sink. If it flies, you fly. And if Jesus can save, then all of your eggs are in that basket. That's how it's to be. The Israelites wandering, murmuring. The word murmur in Hebrew, just like murmur in English, is onomatopoetic. The sound dictates the meaning. It sounds like what it is. Murmur, grumble, 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 grumble. You know, that's what it is. Just a little undercurrent. Don't like this food, don't like this place, don't like this Moses, don't like this God. That's the kind of stuff. They're griping and grumbling. God has been quite patient with them. But there is a limit to God's patience, isn't there? Yes, there is. There is. And I'll tell you this. As one who has experienced that, during a time of rebellion in my younger days, the Lord can snatch the slack out of your chain right quick when He wants to. And He can pull you completely off your feet. And He can get your attention when He decides He's heard enough. Here they are, grumbling against the Lord. We have a sin problem still as saved people. Did you know that? When you receive Jesus as Lord, one of the biggest heresies that you can ever hear is that all your troubles are over. Just come to Jesus. You'll have plenty of money. You'll be in good health. Everything will go your way. You'll have the world by the tail. Just come to Jesus and all your troubles will be over. That's not true. When you come to Jesus, you've turned to face against the current to start making progress against the current. And you face all kinds of difficulty, all kinds of opposition, all kinds of distress. Dead fish can go downstream, but it takes a live one to swim upstream. And you've been given a new life when Jesus came to live in your heart. And it's not just so you can take up a little bit of space down here and one day then go to heaven and everything will be good. No, He leaves you down here. The reason He doesn't take you to heaven the minute you receive Jesus is because He's got a job for you to do. He's got people for you to influence. He's got service and ministry for you to be part of in helping people and reaching them with the gospel. You're a key to somebody's lock. And He wants you to open that. And you may be a key that fits several locks. Why do they get in this trouble? Why do we get in trouble with sin? We'll talk to you about that for just a few minutes. We see the reasons for the predicament. And we find ourselves in this predicament as saved people oftentimes. Why were the children of Israel in this predicament? First of all, we're told that they despised God's way. God was not leading them in the path of least resistance. He was leading them in the path of hardship and difficulty. He was trying to teach them some things. He was also trying to correct them and trying to prepare them for that day when they did enter the promised land, that they'd be strong enough and committed enough and have enough faith to trust Him to give them dominion over it. Well, we're told in verse 4, they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to bypass the land of Edom. And we're told that the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. They didn't like what God was doing. Did God promise that He would do whatever I wanted Him to when I received Jesus as Lord? No, that's backwards, isn't it? I promised to do whatever He wanted me to do. Sometimes we get it a little bit backwards and we forget now who is it that's serving who in this relationship. God's not a little genie in the bottle that you can rub in and He'll come out and do a trick for you. Whatever you ask, give you 3 wishes. We're to be that way available to Him for whatever He says. People forgot that. They despised the way that God was leading them. Why? Because their souls were so beat down with sin and rebellion. And it was a hard time. No doubt about it. For 40 years they've been wandering in the wilderness. And a whole generation is gone. You just think about it. If everybody that was over 20 years old had died, and there was only about 2 or 3 left. As far as I know, they're all dead except for 3, and Moses is going to be died before the book comes to an end. Just Caleb and Joshua and Moses and the rest of them, when they left Egypt, were younger than 20 years. They've been wandering 40 years. So the oldest ones would be less than 60 years old now. Caleb's 85. Moses about 120. We don't know exactly how old Joshua is. But the rest of them less than 60 years. You just think, what if that segment of the population that was 60 years old and older, what if we didn't have anybody in our church older than 60? We'd be missing a lot, wouldn't we? We sure would. Just think of all the wisdom that wouldn't be here. Think of all the experience. Think of all the... I wouldn't do it that way. I'm sorry, I wouldn't do that. That's worth something, isn't it? Yeah, the Israelites don't have that. They despise God's way. There's a second reason for this predicament. They disparaged God's goodness. Look what they're accusing God of doing, verse 5. They spoke against God and against Moses. Why'd you bring us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Well, a lot of people are dying. That wasn't God's plan. God didn't plan to bring them out there to die. The reason they're out there dying is because they refused to trust God and obey Him when He tried to take them into the promised land. They wouldn't go. How often do we rebel against God, and then when God begins to punish us a little bit, then we blame Him for that? That's what they're doing. It's all God's fault. Then they denounced God's leader. They spoke against God and against Moses. Why have ye, that's plural, y'all brought us out here to kill us? God brought us out there because He loved them. He didn't bring them out there because He hated them. But when we don't get what we want, do we ever get upset? Did God ever promise that He'd give you what you want? No. No. My Bible says that He will not withhold from us any good thing. Anything is good for us. And whatever He puts in my path is the best thing for me at that moment. It might not be the most desirable thing from my point of view. Might not be the easiest thing. But it's the best thing. Because God is using that to do something in my life. Right then. Reasons for their predicament. They despised God's way. They disparaged God's goodness. They denounced God's leader. And they detested God's food. They're being fed with something that they couldn't define. We know it as manna. The Hebrew word for manna means, what is it? It's a question. What is it? The only descriptions we have of the manna is by comparison. It was like coriander seed. It had a taste like wild honey. We don't know. It was a small round thing. Small as the hoarfrost, we're told. That tells us all we need to know, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, you can go out there and see if you see some. I'm sorry, when the dew melted off, it was gone. You needed some every day. It fell fresh every morning. You had to go out and get it before the sun got hot. You got to get up early if you want to serve the Lord. The only days that it didn't fall was the Sabbath. But on the day before the Sabbath, it fell twice as much, and you could gather twice as much, and it wouldn't rot. But if you tried to gather up a whole week's worth on Monday, by Tuesday it bred worms and stank. Stunk. But they don't like it anymore. Our soul loathes this light bread. I don't use the word loathe much. For one thing, it's hard to say. I have this lisp on certain words, and I can't say loathe much. They do not like the food that God's given them. I'll tell you this, when your heart's not right with the Lord, you don't have a desire to be fed from God's Word. You have no hunger to know what God's plan is for your life. Because what you're seeing of right now doesn't agree with what I want. I want to be, laying by the pool, drinking a mint julep under an umbrella, suffering for the Lord, His plans don't fit into our plans. He knows it's better for us to have to struggle. And if you read the Bible at all, there's one common denominator among all the people who trust in God. And the common denominator in the life of faith is struggle. struggle. How do you build muscles? You had to work them. You had to have resistance put against them. You have to get tired. You have to get sore. Takes work. Yeah. And I can tell you this, hearing that man with his guitar, he has worked at that. Talent is part of it, but work is a bigger part. In anything that's worthwhile, you got to have an aptitude for it, but you got to work at it. Living the life of faith involves work. It involves steadiness. It involves consistency. And Israel's been anything. They've been consistently murmuring. That's like the guy that said, my spiritual gift is finding the faults in other people. You know. We see the reasons for the predicament. We see the reality of it. They are in sin, and God sends something upon them which symbolizes sin as perfectly as anything we know. Snakes. When sin first came on the scene in human life, it came in the form of a serpent, a snake. There's something about us, we don't much care for snakes. Don't much like spiders either, by the way. But snakes, what we're talking about right now. And I guarantee if we went around the room, everybody's got a snake story. I'll tell you one of mine. I've told you one about blowing the end off the water hose that night. A man hired me when we were planting a church. And I was back to doing carpenter work because I was volunteer as a preacher starting a church. We left a church in a pretty good situation to go do that. And a man hired me to take the insulation out from under his house because the condensation had made it all soggy and it wasn't working. And he had some moisture problems under there. And he hired me to take his insulation out from under his house and replace it. So I was under there. Glad to have the work. Got under there. I was going to get all that insulation out quick as I could. And I was under. There was a pretty good crawl space under there. It was probably about that much distance under the house, room to work. It was a pretty nice situation. I was pulling that stuff out and piling it in a pile, and the little access door to get to the outside was over there about where that door is. And I was over in the middle. Pulled out a piece of insulation, and a black snake about 5 foot long landed in my lap. And I broke the sound barrier between here and the front pew. Looked around, that snake was headed for that pile of insulation to hide in it. And I thought it is just a black snake, but I thought it's a snake. And I couldn't find anything under the house to kill it with. But I did find a little piece of corrugated plastic pipe about that long. And I finally got that snake cornered in the corner of the crawl space over there. And I beat him with that pipe and did away with him. Took him out, threw him across the tree limb thinking maybe it'll rain. That's what the old people used to say. Went back under the house and I was pulling those pieces out. And I was about half done. Didn't see no more snake. Next to the last piece, I had relaxed by that time. And that other snake's mate landed in my lap. But I knew where there's a piece of pipe. And I went and got it and took care of that snake and thought maybe it'd rain twice now. We don't like snakes. Now, if I can see it over there, it's not so bad. But if it's got me cornered or I've got it cornered or it's right under my feet, that's a different story. And it doesn't make much difference when that happens what kind of snake it is, because snake is scary to me. A little bit, yeah. Snakes are sneaky. You do oftentimes not see them. They don't broadcast their travels. Yeah, the snake that's got the rattle on its tail, that's not, he doesn't go around rattling it so you stay away from him. He rattles it right before he gets you, you know. Heard about the little boy that said, I found a baby snake. And his mama said, how you know? He said, I had a rattle. Snakes are sneaky just like our enemy. This sin has been deceitful, and their eyes have been blinded by it, and hearts have been deceived by it. And the Lord sends these fiery serpents. I used to think, I remember in Sunday school, a little bitty boy thinking, just think, there's a snake and it's smoking, you know. That's not what's being described. The idea is that when that snake bit you, it sets you on fire. We don't have fire snakes, we have fire ants, don't we? They're pretty bad. Yeah. One of my predecessors at a previous church, when I got there after he had left, we had a real problem in the cemetery with fire ants. And I hadn't been there very long till I heard the story at the graveside part of a funeral one day. That guy was standing right there doing, reading his scripture and having his prayer and all this stuff. And he was standing on a mound of fire ants. And they tore him up. And he just about didn't get over that. Fire ants bad enough. Fire snakes. People are dying, and these snakes are coming in, biting a lot of people. Bit the people, and much people of Israel died. It's serious. The reality of the problem, sin will kill you. And even if you are a Christian, sin will result in your life not amounting to what God planned for it to do. No, the devil can't have you for eternity, but if he can get you to sin, he can ruin your life as a Christian. He can. You know, the only thing that a Christian can't do that a lost person will do is go to hell. You can get as far off in sin as a Christian as you ever did when you were lost. You can rebel against God that much in this life to where the sum total of your effectiveness as a Christian adds up to a big fat zero. Do you know, I could, as a pastor of a church, there's certain things that I could do that would disqualify me from ever being in the pulpit again. Particularly if I charted a course for my life that was contrary to God's revealed will. Maybe one thing might not for a person. But there's just think. What if Jennifer and I split up? What if I ran off with 3 or 4 other women? Oh, I told her, I think it's on the way over here this morning, that me and Rebecca's boyfriend, our names should be Dumb and Dumber. But just think about that. If she and I split, that might not totally, but that would hinder me in the ministry, wouldn't it? How would I do any kind of good teaching about how to have a Christian home? It'd be a major complication, wouldn't it? The Lord's real patient with us. And one thing doesn't usually ruin our Christian life, but when we start down that road and we add something else and something else and something else, we can mess up big time to where we have handcuffed the Lord as far as being able to actually use us. The reality of the predicament, they were real snakes and they were deadly. And they were painful. They're called fiery serpents for a reason. It wasn't that if a snake bit you, later on you'd die in your sleep. And wonder what happened. No. Snake bit you and it set you on fire, and death kind of a relief. Because it hurts so bad. You ever had something that got hurt and when you did it, it hurt and then it hurt worse? Sometimes, yeah, that's the idea here. Oh, painful. The word for fiery here is related to the word for seraphim. You remember the seraphim in Isaiah 6 that were flying around the throne of God, burning ones? These are snakes that would set you on fire. Terrible predicament. They brought it on themselves by the rebellion. But look at the grace of God. We see the reasons, we see the reality for the predicament, but we see also most clearly the remedy for the predicament. God didn't tell Moses, now you go out here and you cut down this bush and you take the sap and you grind it up and you make this little stuff and you rub it on the wound. He told him, make you a replica of one of these fiery serpents. Make it out of brass and put it on a pole so that anybody can see it from anywhere in the camp, and whoever has the faith to look in faith to be delivered from that replica serpent, they'll live. You know what Jesus said? Jesus said in John 3:15, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. A replica of the sin put up on a pole for them to gaze upon and to trust. Jesus Christ, a picture of our sin at its worst. That we killed the Son of God because He didn't please us. And we forgot that we're here to please Him. The essence of sin, selfishness and unbelief. Remedy for the predicament. There is a divine plan. Moses didn't come up with this. Moses prayed and God said, do this. And I'm sure if Moses was anything like us, he'd have been scratching his head. Never would have thought of that. You sure that'll work? Just make a brass replica and hang it up, and if people look, they'll live? I don't know. I want to follow the science, you know. By the way, there's no contradiction between the Bible and actual science. There's a divine plan and a gracious act. Verse 8, Moses made it and put it on a pole, and it came to pass that everyone that's bitten, when he looks, he will live. So Moses made a serpent of brass, put it upon the pole. It came to pass if a man that serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld, he lived. Very simple. Much more simple than we would think or than we would prescribe. We would want to invent some kind of religion, you know. Yes, I will do this that many times. I will give this that many times. I will repeat after me this many times. I will follow these many rules all these many times. All we got to do is trust that God knows what He's doing. Because lots of times it comes down to that. Most of the time, I don't know what God's doing. A good percentage of the time, I don't even know what I'm doing. But He knows what He's doing. And the essence of faith is to trust that God knows what He's doing when I don't have any answers. A gracious act and a universal offer. When any man, when everyone that is bitten, when he looks upon it, shall live. And if the serpent had bitten any man, you know, I bet there was people got bit 4 or 5 times. I remember as a little boy, my mama read it to me out of the Sand Hill Citizen. You remember that? This lady out in her garden stepped on a snake and it bit her, and she jumped up and landed on him and he bit her again. I don't know the conclusion to the story. But anybody that had been bitten, didn't matter how bad the bite was. You know. Read about this guy out west in Texas somewhere. His daddy died of a snake bite. And he's going through his daddy's stuff and found his daddy's good cowboy boots. And he put one of them on. And it had a rattlesnake fang still in it from when his daddy got bit. And he had to go be treated for snake bite himself. All kind of snake stories. Oh. But anybody that got bit would live. And one requirement, all they had to do was take a look. Look in faith at that serpent. A young man named Charles, they might have called him Charlie, teenager, headed to church one Sunday in London. It snowed so hard he couldn't get to the church that he normally went to. So he stopped off at a little corner church that was a Methodist church, and it snowed so hard there was only 7, 8 people there that day. Preacher didn't even get there. It snowed so hard. But a deacon got up to give a little devotional, and he read this verse, Isaiah 45:22. Look unto me, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is no other. And the deacon said, you don't have to do anything but look to Him. Look to Jesus. Look to Him. Turn your gaze to Him. And a young Charles Haddon Spurgeon turned to look to Jesus, and his life was changed, and he became known as the Prince of Preachers. And most every pastor today has some of his books. Look to Him. It's very simple. We have to turn our attention back to the Lord. And if you are a Christian and you've gotten off the path and you've got to go in your own direction and the Lord is starting to deal with you, all you got to do is turn your focus and your attention and your heart back to Him. That's what He wants. And when you do that, you'll live. You'll really live. You'll experience joy and power and all this stuff. The rest of the chapter shows what happened after they did that. Israel started to move toward the promised land after that. Right after that. They set forward and began to make progress toward the promised land. They had power to defeat Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. One of them giants had a bed 13 feet long. But he couldn't stand against them. When we become a team player with the Lord, He does all the tackling. We just have to run with Him and trust Him. I don't know what's going on in your life today, but are you the Christian that you used to be? Are you the Christian that you want to be? Are you the Christian that you ought to be? Guarantee what's holding you back. It ain't the Lord. It's all that other stuff that we focus on instead of Him. If you need to rededicate your life to be faithful to Jesus, I urge you to do that. And you can come talk to me, and I'm glad to talk with you and pray with you. You can come down here and you can talk to him. Or you can sit on this front pew if you've got a knee issue. But you don't want to just spend your time wandering in the wilderness for the next 40 years. And then find out too late that God had a wonderful plan He was trying to get you to do. And He finally had to move you on out to the cemetery because you're too old to do it now.